Dang, that's annoying. Okay, I was muted. Anyways, hey folks, my name is Sung, rhymes with lung, like the air you breathe, and I'm a solutions engineer. And if you're here today, you're here to get an understanding of just how Datafold Cloud works, what problems it solves for you, and how you can get started. And just do you imagine a future where you want to work like how I'm about to show you what work can look and feel like? And so before I get started, I'm gonna just wait until like the 3 minute mark just for people to trickle in and get some nice critical mass. But until then, would love to just have people post in the chat. Where are you tuning in from? I'm tuning in from Los Angeles, specifically like Beverlywood, Culver City area. If you know, you know. And yeah, would love to hear people out. And Leo, who's also my peer and teammate, will be the chat champion during this conversation to answer questions async while I am presenting live. All right, so I'll give it a couple moments here. Ooh, nice. I'm seeing some familiar faces here. Oh, whoa. Rover, is that the dog sitting app? I'm looking at you, Eric. That's wonderful. My wife actually uses that app to doggy sit, so that's pretty cool to see. It's nice. All right, cool. I'm gonna give it one more minute before I officially kick things off. Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, keep it going. Yeah. Rover's the reason my wife's taxes are a little bit more annoying to file this year for a return. So in a good way, it's a good problem to have. Cool. All right, it's a 3 minute mark. I think everyone's decompressed and settled in, and let's make this a fun time. I always love doing these things. This is feels like my 100th demo in a row, but I just never get tired because I just love the problems that you folks have and are trying to solve every single day. But just to break down the agenda overall, what this is going to look like is role playing, and that's intentional by design. I'm going to pretend I'm like Eric, I'm like Peter, I'm like any other data engineer on this team. And I want you to think to yourself in your inner dialogue as you're nodding your head, whether you're passively listening or actively just watching and staring at me in the camera, of like, do I want to work like how Sung is role playing right now? And if yes, like nod your head, let me know what resonates with you in the chat, and Leo can help further evolve that conversation. If not, like interrupt us and say like, actually, I don't like how that would change it or even disrupt how I work, right? And let's evolve the conversation from there. Either way, progress is progress, right? And so let's just go, let's make some of the assumptions of the crowd here, or even just like the role playing head I'm playing. I'm a data engineer on a team. We are selling software, and we have an existing DBT project. We're using like Snowflake and DBT and GitHub. And, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going through, hey, I got an ad hoc request to change a specific data model, specifically to our star schema to like better incorporate how we sell software. And then that's the prompt heading into this. All right. So let's get right in. So step one is I'm probably living and breathing in VS Code. And that's something that looks like this. All right. And then give me 1 second here. There we go. So step one is, okay, I was tasked with updating some things. I've learned just from my accounting team that for whatever reason we weren't like properly accounting for individual users correctly when we are segmenting our revenue, right? And that's a bad thing because we actually want to know and understand like what's in our control versus not to help drive adoption of the software that we're selling, right? And so I already made this change ahead of time, but just so you can digest this better, I did something that looks and feels like this, where it's like, hey, I have some tribal knowledge, so I know like, oh, I know exactly what DBT model to touch. That's where I have to go to dim orgs and go like, okay, I need to change this to make sure we encounter this scenario when individual user count equals 1. We make sure to include them as part of that subplan so we can better segment it later. I did some cleanup here with like pricing just to make sure it's 0. There's no such thing as negative prices. And then, oh, hey, like these tables are pretty similar because I have this tribal knowledge. And so I think to myself, oh, I think this is a pretty innocent switch out. Okay, we're good to go from there. From there, I'm like, oh, hey, I know I have to also update this important DBT model in order to understand like, hey, like let's make sure we're cascading this all the way through, right? From there, if, I'm using some free extensions today, I'm probably doing something like this where I'm like, hey, I want to see a preview of this result, understand how lineage looks and feels overall using the DBT Power User extension. And I can kind of eyeball it. And I'm like, okay, I think this kind of makes sense. I can even do something like this where I just run a specific DBT model because, right, I'm still in the midst of development. I want to see the shape of my data overall. And I'm like, great, like things passed, or maybe I already wrote some tests ahead of time. And I'm like, hey, I just want to make sure things are mechanically working based off my changes. But you notice here, like, these are all just like rules of thumbs and heuristics to kind of like feel around the metaphorical element or elephant, excuse me, of just like what the data will, how the data will change after these code changes, right? And so I'm still kind of poking in the dark, trying to make sense of what's going on, right? So that's where, oh, hey, I heard of this like great tool called DataDiff, which is Datafold's open source utility in order to diff DBT models in the first place. That's where I already have this pre-installed, but I can do something like this, where I run DataDiff DBT. It takes the latest run that I ran, which is dim orgs, and it does a comparison between the prod version of this table versus my dev version locally here. And from there, I see some really cool things where I'm like, oh, okay, like I'm looking at this, I notice, hey, primary key is org ID. Oh, how did I get that? That's how it was defined over here with this tag. Even if you didn't have this, we can infer that just from the first unique test on the first column within your schema file. From there, as I'm digesting this, and let's just even pretend it's the first time doing this, where I'm like, okay, prod is on the left. Okay, that makes sense. Yep, this looks right. This looks like dev. Yep, that all makes sense. Over here, I notice some napkin math is being done on my behalf, which is great. I don't like doing math in my head all the time. I notice, okay, here was added, removed. Oh, it looks like it does that for me. Here's what's different. Here's what's unchanged. And here are all the columns that are different as a result. And what's really powerful about this is I could probably manually, create these statistics and their support on my own. And that will take 20 minutes. I may do that like 2 or 3 times in a row if I'm a go-getter, but I'm not going to do that 20 times in a row every single time I'm in development, right? So that's where this is really powerful. Now, I think to myself, like, this is really cool, but, what really matters when I'm making these like data changes is like, how will these cascade all the way downstream into, things like Looker or Tableau if I have that in production, right? Because that's what stakeholders really care about at the end of the day. They don't care about how cool my code changes are in DBT. They want to know like, hey, is my revenue dashboard in Looker going to break, right? And I want to give an intelligent, contextually informed answer rather than just like, based on my tribal knowledge, I think so, right? Or I think not. That's where you don't have to play those guessing games, right? Where if you have the cloud integration today, and I'm going to do this simpler. Actually, I'll just do everything. It'll run the same data diff, but give you a lot more quality information and context that you probably care about, right? And so while that's running, you're probably wondering like, how exactly do the mechanics of this work with the cloud integration? All you really have to do is make sure you have at least a unique test on a column within your schema file, in addition to exporting an API key that looks like this, export Datafold API key equals a bunch of this gibberish. And then also just make sure you anchor your prod database, your prod schema, and integration you set up within Datafold. And I'm happy to walk through that later in a bit. But back to my role-playing hat here. It's like, okay, cool. Like it looks like Datafold did something different with the data diff. Very similar napkin math to last time, but I noticed, oh, hey, it's showing the percentage of diff values, which just helps me understand the blast radius of my changes, right? Versus just pure row counts. And whoa, look at this. I also get to see how data assets are impacted downstream. But this just gives me directional guidance, right? Like I actually want to see like, hey, what are these exact 11 Tableau assets and exact 4 Looker assets? That's where I don't have to play that guessing game. I literally click on this and I'm going to reshare my screen just so you can see What am I referring to? All right. I'm going to reshare my entire screen here. Okay, fantastic. And from there, when I clicked on that link in VS Code over here, it brought me to this overview tab, which is a very similar summary report that you saw within your terminal. But there's a couple things here where it's like, oh, I get, kind of a high level overview of like what changed, and I get to see the schema changes if there are any in between those things. But really the meat and potatoes of this experience is, bam, I get to see value level differences across dev and prod. Column A is prod, column B is dev, no guessing games. And as I'm going through this exercise, what's really powerful about this is like, whoa, like something that I would manually do, even if I'm a go-getter, would take like 20 to 30 minutes. And then what I realized here is like, oh, like I don't have to even think about those mechanics of those ad hoc full outer joins. I just get to react to the differences and just be immersed in the work, right? Just one step closer to what feels like a very elusive flow state when you're doing your data engineering work, right? And from there, I'm thinking to myself like, hey, like I remember in the overview tab, it said like a couple of these assets are impacted. Like, how can I dive deeper, right? Because I don't just care about the object level lineage. I want to see column level. That's where you don't have to play those guessing games, as I said before. Over here, I get to see a couple things in a tabular format. And I go, hey, I made a big change to the subplan field in my SQL logic. I want to know what's happening there. From there, I look at this and I'm like, whoa, okay, here's exactly how my change to the subplan field cascades all the way down. And I'm like, this is cool and all, but I best digest and internalize column level lineage in a graph format. That's where we got you covered. Over here, I look at this and I'm like, okay, this takes me to the subset of lineage, and whoa, it shows me exactly like what I expect. But let's say, hey, I really care about some of the looker objects that were impacted. How exactly is that going to be impacted? That's where I go over here and I'm like, hey, like I know my changes will impact revenue. How is that going to cascade all the way through? This is exactly how. Every step of the way, starting from dim orgs, I get this column level lineage all the way down, right? And what's really powerful about this is, as I'm thinking to myself, is like, hey, does this rely on, the DBT manifest? Thankfully, the answer is no. It actually relies on your full query history and the metadata across, in this case, Snowflake and Looker. And we marry those things together. And I have not seen a tool, at least in the mainstream market, that does column level lineage across your data warehouse tables and the actual BI column level objects that you actually care about, right? And so if I'm going through this same role-playing scenario of like, hey, when I talk to Bob in accounting, right, of like, hey, how are you going to impact my, fact or my, fact monthly financials like view and looker? I can say like, hey, I'm impacting in this very specific way, right? And we can just have a much more intelligent starting point to iterate on that conversation versus like, oh, I think it will kind of touch this, but maybe not. And what's so powerful about this is, as you notice, like all of this is happening within my development environment, right? Like I can hack and slash away and have peace of mind. I'm not accidentally breaking anything because everything is happening specific to my self-contained environment when I'm doing these diffs, when I'm doing development. And so it just gives me so much more freedom and imagination to explore and iterate on my work, right? From there, I'm thinking to myself like, hey, I just want to like tweak a couple things within here. I don't want to diff all the columns in scope. I want a curated experience, even when it comes to the diffing, right? Because let's say I have 100 columns and I don't want to diff all of 100 columns to get a meaningful diff result. That's where you don't have to play that game. You can add a couple things like this. And I even added a tag here if you want, where essentially all this is doing is like, hey, like let's pretend I have like 20 columns. I only want to diff the subplan and I want to filter for num users equal 1 just to make sure that specific change is taking place as I expect, right? And then from there, I'm going to rerun that diff. It's going to go through the same changes, going to pick up the YAML changes that I made, and it's going to show me some nice specific filters just to say like, hey, like this is the exact configuration of the diff you wanted, right, son? So I'm going to wait a couple moments for this. In Shazam over here, this gives a nice like visual cue of like, hey, is this diff taking in my custom changes that I just made on the fly? And thankfully the answer is yes, it is. It's automatically taking that in. So it's like, okay, so I know this diff is scoped for this very curated experience. I get to take a look at this and I'm like, okay, this all generally makes sense to me. Cool. And what's really nice about this is that only took like literally a second versus like, oh, I have to now reconstruct my ad hoc full outer join to recreate the same diff result. I don't even have to care about that inner dialogue anymore. I just get to do the work, right? And a lot of the data work that I'm sure you folks do, you get to a certain point where it's like you're building an articulated opinion of how you think the data shape should look and feel so that Bob in accounting can best use that data to like build an action on top of, right? So from there, I'm thinking to myself like, hey, like this is really cool and all, but I actually want to formalize this as part of a pull request workflow. I'm thinking, what does that look and feel like, right? That's where I don't have to play that guessing game. We already built a first-class workflow for that. And so I'm going to, again, go through a very similar role-playing scenario where I'm like, okay, cool. I see this pull request. I open it up. What happens from there? From there, I just validate like, yep, these are the changes in scope I made in VS Code locally. That's good. Thumbs up all around. From there, what's really nice is it automatically kicks off that data diff, right? And so you don't even need to input the data diff command that you saw locally in your terminal in there and put in a GitHub action. We do all that work and plumbing on your behalf through a native GitHub app. And so after, whether you're using DPT Core on cloud, your job succeeds, right? Like testing things mechanically, such as like unique and not nulls for primary keys, it'll automatically kick off Datafold. And from there, we see a couple things where it gives me a summary report similar to what I saw last time. It shows me what's really nice about this is it better even curates that information for the context of a pull request to say, hey, Sung, this is all the signal, this is all the noise. But here it is, just so you have a benchmark for, hey, did I expect this thing to even not change in the first place, right? In addition to saying data app dependencies. And when I'm like, hey, I want to dive deeper into this beyond just this directional port, I can. And it takes me to the exact same view that I got from the Data Diff Cloud CLI integration, right? From there, I'm like, okay, this is cool. This is cool. And I'm noticing here that, oh yeah, that same thing that I changed. But you notice here that something was skipped. And I'm like, okay, what the heck is going on over here? And what's really powerful about this is very similar to kind of like the DPT Slim CI mechanic. At Datafold, we created the Slim Diff mechanic. And what's really nice about this is we only run the things by default that DBT code changes cost, right? In this case, it was DimOrgs and SalesSync. And if you want, you could do one of two things where it's like, hey, let's pretend there's like 100 downstreams. You may not want to run 100 of all downstreams and you just want to run like 2 or 3 of them. You can just by clicking this button. Or if you're like, hey, actually, do you want to run all those downstreams? It's pretty important because we're changing revenue numbers. All you have to do is create a label. And I mean that very literally. You just have to create one that looks like this. And then once you do, it'll automatically diff everything downstream. And when we do, it kicks off those data diffs and it shows me the same summary reports as last time and runs the same summary reports and gives me those detailed views as I expect for those other downstreams. And that's it. Now you're thinking to yourself like, hey, what in Datafold do I have to, how hard is it to set that up? It feels like there's some weird configurations going on. You just have to click like 1 or 2 buttons within Datafold. And so when I go over here, I'm going to click on settings. I'm going to go to CI. I'm going to click on this. And all I have to do is click Slim Diff. And if I want, I'm like, hey, I don't want a Datafold to pull request to run every single time. I can also click this to make sure there's just a Datafold label. And that's it. So from there, I think to myself like, hey, like all of this cool work is happening. Oh, there we go. All this cool work is happening. And now I think to myself like, hey, once all this happens, I can merge, I can move on with my life. And let me just go through this workflow one more time here. What's really powerful about this is you're probably thinking to yourself, especially if you're a veteran data engineer, is, yeah, I could probably build a diffing mechanism on my own, create some ad hoc joins. Again, I may do that 2 times in a row, even 20 times in a row if I'm like really gung-ho for a mission critical table. But even if I just have a team of like 3 to 5 to 10 people, do I believe all of us are going to diff all the time to make sure we capture all the changes in scope? Probably not, right? In addition to creating that column level lineage impact, so you're not playing any guessing games as to like, hey, how exactly do my code changes impact essentially like the end layer that my end users actually care about, right? Probably Bob from accounting doesn't even know what DBT is, but he probably knows what Tableau and Looker are because that's his entry point to understanding your data changes at its heart. And so that's pretty much the CI workflow. Leo, let me know if there are any questions in the chat that are worth bringing up live before I talk about a migration use case here. All right.
Hey there. Sorry, I had to find the button. I think, Sung, it would be really great. I think this might have come up in the migration story, but there was a question in the chat from Peter. Uh,
Yeah.
would the value, let me see some sample rows where things are different so I can see how they changed. And when you were going through the values tab earlier,
Hmm.
it was a little hard to see.
Oh, okay.
So maybe you could like dwell on that a bit, zoom in
Yeah.
and really like wallop us with the values tab as well as the column profiles. And I think that those would be the main areas where you could see the value level difference as well as the distribution.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thanks, Peter, for the question. Really good, really
Yeah, for
valuable.
sure. I think that's, I'm gonna duck out. I'll come back though if something else comes
Yeah,
up.
for sure. Here. There we go. And I'm going to go through here. Let me pick a good one. Here we go. So I'm going to look at the dim works table over here. And I'm going to wallop you again with the values tab. Shazam. Over here. And so how I'd interpret this again, just to set a baseline, column A is prod, column B is dev. Here are all the changes in scope. If I want, let's say there were like 100 columns differences, you're probably wondering like, hey, is there a way to like freeze columns similar in Excel? And thankfully the answer is yes. And so if you want, you can do that and scroll side to side in order to understand like, hey, I want to compare some of these column changes to the other ones just to better build a picture of what these differences are actually going to do, right? And so there's that piece over there. From there, if I'm like, hey, I want to explore this further and do some ad hoc querying on top of this to like better really, understand this at like a molecular level of differences, you can just clone those diff results, run it, rerun it, and it'll store it within Snowflake in my case in order to explore those diffs, right? From there, I'm thinking like, hey, I want to see like a medium level of detail. Like this is really good because I want to get super low level, but I'm like, hey, I want to understand the distribution of my changes. So that's where I go over to column profiles. And I know I made a big change to the subplan field. And that's where I go over here. I notice that like, hey, we have like individual, it's a net new category, which makes sense. And so, yeah, this all tracks with me. And so I'm going to pause there. Peter in the chat, does that answer your question? And I guess I have some time to look at it. Oh, I see some thumbs up. Beautiful. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate you. Ooh, okay. So Drew, I just saw that question. With tables in the 100 million plus row count, what do you recommend for running diffs? Great question. I recommend a couple things. Two things. One is you can add a filter. You'll probably have a 100 million plus row table for like an incremental GPT model, right? That's where you add a configuration like this. Only include specific columns and scope that you care about diffing, and also add a filter. We've seen some people add like dynamic dates where it's like date, what's it called, greater than or equal to current. I'm writing some like pseudo SQL here, current date minus 7, right? Something like that to say like, hey, because incremental models, you're only inserting and appending like maybe 7 days worth of data or like maybe a day's worth of data every day, right? And so that's where this adds some buffer for like, hey, I want to see differences for the past week. And you can do that from there. There's also sampling. So I'm going to go back to Datafold over here, where you can essentially run a diff. Actually, I'm going to show you the settings here real quick. Or essentially where you're saying like, hey, any table that's like more than 50 million rows of data, based off some of these sapling parameters. And essentially what this is saying is like, hey, like I want a 99.9% confidence that, there's going to be at most like a 0.001 error that like I'm missing like a fair distribution of the sampling method. And then we use something called the Poisson distribution, which is a statistical method that takes in these parameters. It essentially says like, hey, for this 50 million row table, I'm going to sample maybe like, 100,000 of these rows that are representative sample distribution in order to run those diffs in the first place. If you're like, hey, like I just want an even distribution sample to run these diffs, and what that could look like is something like this, or I'm like, hey, I want to see here, let me do one that's actually constructed already. Go over here. I'm going to clone this. I can add numbers here. I can enable sampling, input those parameters, even override certain thresholds. It'll automatically calculate a sample size. In this case, it knows like, hey, Sung, these are only 157 rows. I'm going to diff everything here. It doesn't make sense to sample, right? And from there, you run it. You can also say like, hey, I want to make sure there's a tolerance for floats because rounding errors happen all the time. I can adjust that as well. I run it, and I'm good to go. And so that's the last question I'm going to take before I go into the migration use case. And then James, actually, I'm going to do that since I just saw it, where it's like, hey, like I want to see the distribution of changes. You can also see, yeah, just like some of those like high level stats that you probably care about. Total rows, distinct rows. Great. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through the migration use case. So I'm like, hey, like, let's say I'm doing all this great work, but I realize like, hey, like we still have some things in, let's say, Databricks that we need to migrate over into Snowflake for whatever reason, or vice versa. That's where we have cross-database diffing in play. And what that looks and feels like is something like this. Let me actually take you to an example here. Let's see if I have one off the cuff. Come on. Ooh, there we go, baby. So very similar premise as to last time. I'll actually show you what that looks like in terms of existing settings where I'm like, hey, I set up a Databricks connection in my settings page. Just make sure I have an API token to access the tables in scope. Very similar to Snowflake with username and password. I make sure I click on, or I just type in the, database schema table name, or I can even run a query if I want to and do the same thing with Snowflake. Whoops. I want to click next. And I'm going to type in the columns that I want to run. From there, after I run those things, I get an overview page very similar to what you saw in development testing. And I also get to see the values level tab specifically for this. It's very powerful. Is column A is Databricks, column B is Snowflake. No guessing games as to how these differences are going to play out. And what's really nice about this is, and kind of as an industry, it's still kind of surprising to me how we all just kind of, trust that whatever data loader we have, whether it's like Fivetran or Hivo data or even your own custom, like you don't actually validate it's apples to apples. You kind of hope and pray it's the same. Maybe you do some heuristics like row counts and column counts, but when it comes to mission critical tables, like you want to know every single detail of difference if there is any, right? And this makes sure that you have no lingering doubts that your extract and load process is doing exactly like what you expect when you're doing a migration. And if you want, you can also schedule this. We're building out some of this functionality, and so I won't show it off too soon yet. I just want to tease you with it. But essentially, like, hey, I want to like schedule this. In the next month or two, you will be able to schedule this and say like, hey, I want this to run on a monitor of like 8 a.m. every day because my Fivetran pipeline runs at 7:30 every day and finishes around that, right? From there, I'm like, hey, like this is cool. I want to better fine tune this. You can. Where I'm going to go back here. Where you can add column remappings where I'm like, hey, and Databricks, this column is actually this column over here, but I want to compare them apples to apples. You can do that, right? Because we recognize the nuance and complexity when you're migrating. Not everything's going to be named the exact same thing, right? From there, if you don't have a primary key, we can construct one that's composite on the fly for you. And then also add a diffing threshold where it's like, hey, like if we notice there are more than 1,000 diffs, let's just stop the diffing process because it's not worth wasting our time running the rest of these millions of rows. Let's just make sure that we investigate those and we can better iterate from there, right? And what's really powerful is like, now I'm thinking to myself like, hey, how exactly is this running behind the scenes? What we essentially do is we push down SQL instructions into Databricks and Snowflake respectively, run some proprietary like hashing algorithms in order to say like, hey, if these checksums are different, unfurl those results so you can see the subset of diffs over time. And that's it. And so pausing here in summary, we talked through dev testing, pull request testing, and what migration workflows look like. Hopefully you notice in your inner dialogue, I want you to do some napkin math of like, whoa, like all these activities that Sung showed off in 30 minutes usually takes me several hours, even a couple days to even get to the same fidelity of experience. And if that's you, happy to evolve the conversation further for your specific needs. But other than that, that's pretty much the whole demo. So I'm gonna leave it up to questions. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and start looking at the chat a bit more. And then Leo, come on stage. We'll do it fireside chat style. All right?
Great. Thanks, Sung. I really enjoyed that, and really great to hear everyone in the chat jumping in. So let's see. Yeah, so I guess going in reverse order, because I think I've tackled most of these questions.
Yeah.
I know James was curious about if you zoom, like rewind all the way back to the beginning, setting up the open source DBT integration there. Do you specify a warehouse for Datafold to use? I believe that all of that is defined in the profile. Yeah.
Yeah, I can explain the mechanics. So if you're using open source data diff, it'll re-leverage your DBT profile. And so if it was like an extra small for your DBT runs, it'll be the same there. But if you're like, hey, I want Datafold to use something different when you're using the cloud integration, whether in pull requests or in the CLI, let me actually show you the settings page because seeing is believing here. Give me a sec. Within settings, you can actually dictate what exact warehouse it's using, so you can even track usage over time, right? That's where, yep, I want to leave this. Go to data sources, Snowflake. That's where I pick the warehouse. And so let's say, hey, I want to make sure that a large or a medium is running at any given time. I can do that. And I'm like, hey, I want to know what exact user is running those diff queries. I can do that too with the dedicated Datafold username and password that you run, right? And so what's really nice is like you get to pick and choose, right, of just how much performance you want in your diffs. All right, I'm going to stop sharing there. Perfect. Thanks, James. I'm assuming that thumbs up means it answers your question. Beautiful. Lee, I'll let you take the next question here.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure there's anything super open, but Peter, I'll just kind of maybe speak to some of them. So Peter asked about the API. And so as Sung was showing in your monitors interface, you could set off or you could schedule like a continuous monitor, which diffs every hour or every day or whatever. And like a lot of teams seem to really like having a GUI for that. But everything that you see in the Datafold UI is API driven. And as a Datafold customer, there's no restriction basically to how you use our API. So the docs I'll actually share the docs. So the docs are live and public, so you could kind of explore those. And so we do have teams, here we go. We do have teams who had that exact use case. They have something triggered in Airflow. They want to do what the monitor's UX is doing, but have it all kicked off via Airflow. So we also have teams who aren't. I know, like I looked at the poll, most people are on DBT, but if you're not on DBT for whatever reason, we have teams who have our whole CI workflow hooked up using our API. Some brand names that you've heard of are doing exactly that. And so you don't need to feel like this is tied to DBT. You don't need to feel like it's tied to the UX. Good question, Drew. So we are definitely looking at moving into the anomaly detection space. I would say we are always going to be, our core is probably always going to be like nearly everything Sung talked about was anchored to this data diff technology empowered by lineage, right? So we're comparing two versions of tables in various use cases. We're using lineage to make sure we get the richest analysis of downstream impact. However, teams don't want to be using 50 different tools, and we have found that a lot of teams can get enough of that kind of observability monitoring capability out of Datafold, even with our current tool set. You can imagine actually using Snowflake time travel, for example, to diff a version of a table to yesterday's version or an hour ago's version. But we are looking at some more of that out of the box anomaly detection. So that I would say in the next 3 to 6 months, that'll be going live.
Yeah, and I think that's a good extension of even Peter's question here, and I can take that on.
Oh, great call. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and where you can, Peter, use that, but it won't give you what column level lineage impact, right? If like, hey, this is an important table that affects a Looker dashboard or a Tableau dashboard, right? To just having those diffing mechanisms and that UI UX out of the box versus you'd have to construct that yourself, or you'd have to do a full outer join and construct that time travel query. between that Snowflake table in itself. And for specific DBT tables, if they're rewriting all the time, time travel just by design can't work, right? Because there's no history for that recreated table as of today versus yesterday.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different answer, which I think just sort of adds, but it's like a different angle on it. So like for CI diffing, time travel is not gonna like accomplish anything really because of what Sung just said. If you're looking to validate, like the use case that we have in mind for this, like recurring diffing, is really more for validating differences between different databases. So you might have like a continuous replication from Postgres to Snowflake, and you want to continuously validate that the ETL worked, that the data matches exactly. So time travel wouldn't help you with that because you're not comparing past to present, you're comparing Postgres to Snowflake. If what you're trying to do is something that is more like observability, where you want to diff 1 hour ago to the present and validate that there are no more than 500 new rows or something like that, that you've decided was like an acceptable value, and otherwise you get a notification, then I could see time travel actually working quite well through our monitors UX. So it really depends. Like, what are you trying to compare, right? Two versions of one table. Is it Postgres to Snowflake? Then you would want to use cross-database monitoring. Is it Snowflake an hour ago to Snowflake right now? Then you could use time travel combined with monitoring. Is it your PR data to your production data? Then time travel is out of the picture, and you would want to compare, your prod data to whatever was built in CI using our CI integration. So I know we just threw a lot at you. Peter, give us something so that we know that made any sense at all. Yeah, thank you for that really good question there.
Heart.
That's nice.
All
Thank you,
right.
Peter.
Peter
Yeah.
loves you, Leo. That's what that
Well,
means.
if you put up in the chat, Peter actually says he's not an AI, but I think he might be, and I am. So we have a connection. All right, James. One thing we'd be interested in is column level lineage. Is there a way to compare the column changes against all of the downstream models that use the field? I think this is, so Sung, would you mind pulling up the downstream impact? Because I want to make sure, I
Sure
think
thing.
that's what we're getting at.
Yeah. Give me one second. Let me reorganize my screen real quick.
Yeah, and I'm rereading this, and I'll try to answer this while you do that. So all the downstream models that use the field. So what Sung's about to pull up is we identify the downstream, all good, James. We identify the downstreams that depend on the modified columns. So right now you see a lot. Sung, if you, I suggest in the left, just unselecting some of those BI types.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just to make it a little cleaner. So the idea here is that we will not identify like monthly financials, sales sync, and yearly financials unless they specifically depend on a column that is modified in the diff. So in the dimorgs diff. So in this case, I believe 2 columns are modified. And so what this is telling us is that these downstreams depend not just on any column in dimorgs, but on those specific columns. Now, in CI, we also kick off diffs of the downstreams. And so to actually see the impact on those downstreams, you would need to go to the other diffs that are linked from your GitHub pull request. But this, at least, the idea here is that this is just like a quick way of using like very specific column level lineage, depending on the impacted columns, to know what could possibly be impacted. So it really quickly like eliminates a lot of what could be seen as noise in terms of, this stuff is downstream. Does it also include if the column is used not in the select? Yeah. So if the column, it includes everything, any possible impact is accounted for. I will state that if it's used in the where clause, then it will consider it to possibly have impacted any downstream column. So there's not much we can do about to refine it from there. It's it looks really clean and tight when like it's only in a case statement, and then you can be like, okay, these 2 columns, and then it's this one, and then like that's it, right? Whereas if it's in a join condition or a where clause, basically we have to say that possibly any downstream table is impacted because they all would, have row differences based on that. But yeah, so I hope that helps, James. I'm seeing positive response from you. And naturally, all of this is, fairly complex to absorb over this kind of setting. So we do hope to have a chance to work with each of you one-on-one and find time to get started. So I'm going to pull up a Calendly to share.
Yeah,
Not
you do that.
So I'll put that in the chat if you don't mind, like elaborating a bit on what I was just saying. Like I'm not trying to what and like how we do trials. That'd be awesome, just so people have a sense that it's not like we're not trying to like get you to write a check. We just want to like give you a chance to try the tool and see what it's like.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what part of that to clarify.
Well, what's our trial? What's our whole like
Oh, I
onboarding
see. It's
trial
just the
like?
trial
Yeah.
flow, and okay, got it. Okay. So when you work with us, happy. Well, like there's kind of like two paths, maybe two subsections of one path is like, hey, I want a deeper dive demo on like, and dive deeper into some of the mechanics of how Datafold works. You can spend 30 minutes with us to do that and give you a much more custom demo versus this one more like standard public one that you just saw. And you're like, hey, I actually want to taste and see this for myself in my own working environment. We do 2-week trials. And what that looks like is you spend an hour of onboarding with us to get connected to your data warehouse, your GitHub, your BI tools, etc. And we make sure that a dry run works. And once it does, you can just do your work, right? Because the whole premise of this is it's a UX layer on top of your already existing kind of quality workflow. And we want to be just kind of like an added joy of like, oh, this is a nice like thing that's just like supercharging how I work without having to like learn a whole new mechanism or a mental model for how to do this work, right? And then those 2 weeks, you keep a pulse check on just making sure that you feel like you're winning with the tool. And then, we evolve the conversation from there. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we and I'll just add we do set up Slack channels with everyone, all of our customers, including in the demo, but like we don't disappear when you go live. So that I just find that like that is a really good way of responding if any questions or concerns come up throughout. We're a pretty small team, so you would like very much be hearing from us as individuals as well as our the team behind us. And yeah, so I think that like I was saying, the best way to like get your questions answered is to get into the tool, but obviously we want to make sure we answer those up front if there's anything that you feel like would be a blocker or like a major concern. And otherwise, yeah, we'd be kind of standing by to get this set up in your environment. So I think we're getting close to time, but definitely I see some people are still on the line. We're not talking to ourselves here, so if anyone does have a final question or comment, or more than or several, we can stick around if there's anything else that's on folks' mind. I see that only 6 people have participated in my poll, and it's a tie actually. So if you were to jump into the poll and make your voice heard, then we could have a satisfying democratic consensus, but just if you want. It's interesting, actually, noting no one has voted that they use exclusively dbt Cloud. I also voted some of both because, well, we do actually use dbt Core at Datafold, but I touch dbt Cloud all the time with customers, and we see a lot of people who use it for scheduling jobs, but then they do their development in VS Code. So I imagine that's what you mean there. I guess to conclude, I see Peter typing. If so, by all means, if you have a question, please ask it. But would love to hear if there's anything in particular that resonated with the group, or if you're feeling good, then we can wrap up and leave it at that. So seems like people are signing off. So let's call it.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thanks, Leo. All right. Peace out, y'all.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Bye.